Xtalks is the industry leader in connecting life science, food, healthcare, and medical device professionals. The Xtalks Life Science Podcast features insightful conversations with industry experts about all things pharma, biotech, and more.
Hello and welcome to the Xtalks Life Science Podcast. I'm Ayesha Rashid, Senior Life Science Journalist at xtalks.com. And this week I am so happy, delighted to have a very special guest on our show today. With us, we have Dr. Andrew Menzies-Gow, who is the Vice President of Respiratory and Immunology, Global Biopharmaceuticals Medical at AstraZeneca. So in this episode, we're going to be looking at the evolving landscape of respiratory and immunology drug development with Dr. Menzies-Gow, who is an expert in respiratory biologics and severe asthma research, and who has had a prolific career in respiratory medicine, combining his background as a practicing clinician with strategic leadership to advance innovative therapies that address some of the greatest unmet needs in the field. Under his leadership at AstraZeneca, the company has delivered groundbreaking studies that have helped shape clinical guidelines and improved standards of care globally. Dr. Menzies-Gow has a medical degree from St. George's Hospital Medical School in London and a PhD from the National Heart and Lung Institute, Imperial College. He has served as chair of the NICE Guideline Development Group for Asthma, Diagnosis and Monitoring, and as National Clinical Director for Respiratory Disease for NHS England. So without further ado, to gain insights into AstraZeneca's vision in the respiratory and immunology space, the innovations shaping the future of care, and how global strategies are translating into real-world impact for patients, let's turn to Dr. Menzies-Gow now. Thank you so much for being on the show with us today.
Oh, no, thank you. Thank you for that lovely introduction. Really pleased to be here.
Really looking forward to the conversation, and I would love to first, of course, learn about your background and your interests in the field and what led you to AstraZeneca, again, as a practicing clinician, and really combining that side of things and drug development in industry, and really in such an important space with continuing unmet needs like respiratory and immunology. And so would really love to learn more about your background, your work, and what drew you to the space.
Yeah, thank you. I'll try and keep it reasonably succinct. So I always wanted to be a doctor. Both my parents were doctors. It was a very logical thing for me to do. And when I did my training, I loved all of it. I didn't know what I wanted to do, but I had some great mentors at St. George's. And I decided I wanted to be a pulmonologist for lots of different reasons. I found it a fascinating area and really important to try and improve outcomes for people with respiratory disease. But when I started as a pulmonologist, I quite quickly realized that at that point, things were tough. Many of the conditions we looked after, there weren't great treatments for. So I gravitated towards asthma because even back then we had some great therapies for the majority of people with asthma. We could really make a difference. And people would come back and say, thank you, I feel so much better. So then I started to specialize in severe asthma at the National Heart and Lung Institute. And then I realized that actually there was this group of people with asthma, with severe asthma, that the drugs really weren't great for. And I became a consultant in that area, and it was a challenge. And then suddenly we had our first biologic in severe asthma, and it was transformational. But it was only for about 10% of people. But it was suddenly you got that point. If we get the right drugs into the right people at the right time, we can make such a difference to people's lives. And then more and more biologics came along, and I was very lucky to work with AstraZeneca and other companies on the studies, helping design the studies, and really just see the acceleration in the field. And I often say, and I absolutely mean this, it was an absolute pleasure and a privilege to be a severe asthma doctor at the time of this explosion of biologics, because for the first time ever, we could transform people's lives. And I got more and more focused on doing that, and realized that just as a pulmonologist, I could do amazing things, but I wanted to do more. So obviously I did the things with NHS England, and unfortunate to be the National Clinical Director for NHS England during a once-in-a-century respiratory pandemic that had its own challenges. But when we got through the other side of that, I was working more and more with AstraZeneca, and of all the things I was doing in my career, this was the most exciting for me because we got to do innovative science. We got to partner and change things on a much bigger scale. And I eventually joined AstraZeneca in January of 23 because I wanted to help on a bigger scale. And I recognize as we see our amazing pipeline within AstraZeneca and pharma more generally, unless we work in partnership and transform healthcare, people won't get the right drug at the right time. So I thought this was a great opportunity and I've loved every minute of it. And if I can be honest, I've learnt more in the 2.5 years that I've been working at AstraZeneca than I did in the previous 10 years, because it's so different from being a practicing pulmonologist to understand everything that goes into drug development, to understand everything that we have to do to really shape healthcare delivery to make sure that the right people get the right drug first time.
I love that. Thank you for so much for sharing that, and really how you were able to bridge really that clinical practice, that background, and really the passion I can really hear and feel that you have for really wanting to make an impact and really finding that through drug development and, like you said, the explosion of biologics and therapies that we've been seeing, and so very transformative and just so impactful, and that absolutely wonderful. Thank you so much for everything you do, and absolutely amazing. And so, in terms of at AstraZeneca, of course, a legacy company, very, big pharma and all of that. But really, I love learning more about the niche fields within that big pharma space, and whether it's rare diseases or respiratory immunology, we're seeing a lot of big pharma really honing in on these niche fields and spaces, which is so amazing to see. Not to say, obviously, asthma is a very ubiquitous disease affecting so many people worldwide. And so what really are the goals and targets, dare I say targets, 72 industry, but really what are the goals and vision currently at AstraZeneca in this space that you're helping lead? And what is your vision for this space within this sphere?
Yeah, and I think really importantly, so obviously I'm leading on respiratory and immunology, so similar but different. And I'll start by talking about respiratory. So you're quite right. Some of the conditions are very common. There's 240 odd million people with asthma. There are hundreds of millions of people with COPD. Some of the conditions are much less common, but can be very devastating. And I think across the board with asthma, and one of the reasons I was attracted to AstraZeneca in particular is because there's a clear focus not on just developing new medicines, but understanding how we can use them and how we can transform care to allow them to be used. And certainly in respiratory disease, there's a big issue with early and accurate diagnosis. It can be very difficult to correctly diagnose respiratory conditions in a way that, fortunately, now it's relatively straightforward to measure for high blood pressure with a 24-hour blood pressure monitor or measure high cholesterol with a simple blood test. We're not there with respiratory conditions yet. So early and accurate diagnosis is key. And up until recently, a lot of our treatments have been based on symptom control. Whereas we really need to move forward towards secondary prevention and eventually primary prevention by addressing the underlying drivers of disease rather than obviously alleviating symptoms is very important in the short term, but we want to switch the immunology off or switch the drivers off. So we started to talk about the concept of remission for respiratory disease, which has been used in other areas for a long period of time in terms of switching off the biology to allow for remission and then maybe de-escalation of therapy, but also to prevent the damage from occurring. With respiratory conditions, it's often we all, as we get past the age of the early 20s, we all lose lung function over time. But with many of the respiratory conditions, we lose lung function more quickly. So obviously we want to switch that off to give people less breathlessness, better quality of life, very importantly. And there's a lot of pull from immunology where there's been a greater drive towards remission with some of the conditions for a while. But I think what we recognize about both conditions, our default therapy for very good reasons has often been oral corticosteroids, which are a very broad anti-inflammatory, and certainly in the acute setting, save your life. There's no doubt about that. But I think we've, over time, really understood the long-term side effect profile associated with oral corticosteroids. And then, so we're trying to move away from them whenever possible. And certainly when I was practicing, the people I looked after would tell me they loved and hated steroids in equal measure. They loved them because they made them able to breathe again, but they hated the side effects associated with them. So we really need to move away from those symptom-based treatments, that broad base suppressive inflammation with corticosteroids to much more targeted therapies happening earlier in the disease because we've made the diagnosis very early on. We've predicted who is at high risk of disease progression, and we've intervened much earlier.
And that really speaks to the unmet needs as we talk about for various diseases. And so, for you, what do you see as the greatest unmet needs currently in this space? As you mentioned, the need for targeted therapies is one.
I mean, the unmet needs are huge, and we sometimes reflect that we're not where we want to be. And sometimes when I'm speaking to my pulmonology colleagues, I say, look, we should be more like cardiologists in that we need to be a bit more aggressive in the good way of achieving primary and secondary prevention of making that right diagnosis. If we think about asthma, a very common condition, as I've said, over 240 million people with asthma, but in some countries, 50% of people with asthma are poorly controlled. And that's for a variety of reasons. We have great treatments, but we're not giving them in the right way, or we have to work as a group of healthcare providers, of pharma, of patient and advocacy groups, policymakers, to make sure that respiratory conditions get the focus and attention that they need. So whatever the healthcare system, it does prioritize them in the same way that it quite rightly prioritizes cardiovascular disease and oncology, etc. But that recognizes, for instance, COPD is the third biggest killer in the world. So we need to then apply that same level of intervention to make sure that people with COPD are getting the right drugs at the right time. And that will only happen when we make the diagnosis correctly early on. And then certainly with asthma, we've been very passionate about making sure that people don't just have a reliever treatment without any anti-inflammatory component with it, and combining that anti-inflammatory component with the reliever. So it's a bit like if you've got a broken arm, you take a painkiller, that helps the pain in the short term. It doesn't fix the break. So we've got to do that, right? So we've got to not only improve the symptoms, but target the underlying biology at the time to prevent higher risk down the line. And tragically, people still die with asthma. And obviously, people with COPD can end up in hospital, and it can be life limiting as well. And that's before we think about some of the rarer conditions that we're looking at in our pipeline down the line as well.
And how has our understanding of respiratory conditions, specifically like severe asthma and then some of the more rare conditions, improved in the past several years, past couple of decades? And so you did speak to that in terms of really developing targeted therapies, and those can only be developed once we have a better understanding of the disease biology. And so how far have we come, and what more do you think is really needed to hone in on those mechanisms? And of course, the intersection with immunology, of course, as being one of the foundational aspects and elements in a lot of respiratory diseases.
Yeah, and I mean, absolutely. So we've come a long way. I mean, I think so. What we understand about our lungs is obviously they are a vitally important organ. If we take our lungs and lie them out flat, they're about the size of a tennis court. They're a huge organ. We're breathing in and out thousands of liters a day, and they're a barrier in our first line of defense for many of the things that we'll breathe in and out. And critical, all the blood flow essentially goes through the lungs to get oxygenated and then goes around to the rest of the body. And they're coming under attack from viruses, from pollution, from whatever all the time. So we really understand the role of the lung epithelium, the lining of the lung, and the way that allergy for some people can be very important with asthma. And then the role of key cytokines that we understand now over time, IL-4, IL-5, IL-13, are epithelial derived cytokines such as TSLP and IL-33, and then certain cells like eosinophils, which are key effector cells for some but not all within asthma. So I think we're getting a really good understanding around asthma, a really good understanding that the majority of symptom burden is driven by inflammation, which we need to switch off either by logically combining inhaled steroids with bronchodilators in our inhaled therapy, or if we're looking at targeted therapy with biologics, or potentially different therapies down the line, which bit of the biology is causing the problem. But I'm going to come back to your point. It's starting to be about precision medicine. So there are 242 million people with asthma. They're all different. They've all got slightly different drivers. And if we try and treat everyone the same, we won't get that significant benefit. And I think we're seeing that even more with COPD. as we've tried to take some of our biologics from asthma towards COPD, they've not been as effective as we'd like. And I think we'll look back on this period in time and think that COPD is really a syndrome rather than a firm diagnosis. And there'll probably be 5 or 6 different subtypes, a bit like heart failure was 20 years ago. And now heart failure, we'll think of it in various different categories. I'm sure down the line we'll think the same for COPD. And the thing that we really need to crack, but it's difficult, is exacerbations. So attacks of asthma and COPD, when people get acutely worse, we tend to just prescribe antibiotics or oral corticosteroids, mainly oral corticosteroids for asthma, and antibiotics and or steroids in COPD, with no measurement of what's driving that exacerbation. It's hard to do, right? Because people get acutely unwell. We need to treat them straight away. Often it's in the middle of the night, but we're not measuring any real biomarkers at that point to guide our therapy. So to really drive it forward, we've really got to start personalizing the medicine. So if I was still practicing clinic, when I see someone with COPD, I could say, actually, a third of your exacerbations are caused by this, a third are bacterial, or it's a viral trigger. So we're going to have to think of all these different components, treat all of these in a logical fashion to really get on top of your disease.
And in terms of personalization, I think that really begins right at the clinical trial design point when you're looking at trial designs in terms of who the patients are that you're recruiting and what subsets you're going to have. And so and then you also mentioned really the measurements and the quantitative measures, the qualitative measures in terms of patient-reported outcomes. So there's just so much that goes into clinical research design, clinical trial design, and clinical research today. And so what really, for you, are the important elements when looking at a trial and when looking to design a trial in this space, and in terms of really leveraging various technologies that we're looking at, wearables, and to really gather the right data?
Yep, it's a really important question. And if you'd asked me this 5 years ago when I was a clinician, my answer would have been very different, right? Because I think it's only when you're designing trials, you're talking to regulators, and you realize some of the endpoints that you have to hit versus some that are important to clinicians. And I think very passionately, it's really important we do the trials of the people that we're looking after, the improvements that they want. And I think we're getting much better at doing that. And we have to thread the needle between getting that regulatory approval, plus resonating with the clinicians, and also then resonating with the people that we're looking after. And that's one of the reasons I love working in medical affairs, because we do get to do some of those, fun is the wrong word, but some of those trials that we really, will then impact clinical practice. And there's some examples of some great trials that we've done at AstraZeneca that have built on our phase 3 pivotal trials, which obviously are incredibly important to demonstrate safety and efficacy, to give everyone the confidence to prescribe the drug. But often that's just the beginning. And I would reflect as a clinician when I saw a new phase 3 study, okay, that's great. But which patients do I really use it in? We recognize that probably only 5% of patients can get into these very prescribed trials. So what's the real world evidence? So we generate that in medical affairs, and we generate evidence for patients that we're treating all the time. I think that gives much more confidence when I was talking to the person I was looking after. Said, look, I've used this drug before, and I've seen the clinical trial results, but also in the real world, in people just like you, these are the sort of outcomes that we could expect. And then the next thing is, when people feel better, they're like, well, can I stop this treatment? Can I stop that treatment? And then we can say, because we've done these additional studies, yes, you can. We can stop this one, or let's go a bit more slowly about this and monitor these things. Incredibly important. And the people I used to look after wanted, well, understandably wanted a lot. But if I said, what's the one thing you want? They would say, I don't want to be on steroids. I hate the oral steroids, right? So we've designed some very great trials with some of our biologics in asthma, and now we're moving into lupus to do that equally, to demonstrate that we can remove the steroids and keep people well, because that was a clear message that I always got. And in terms of the way we do it moving forward, we've got to minimize the burden for people as much as possible. Both healthcare systems as they're still recovering post-pandemic, and also people in trials. And if we can do remote monitoring, if we can use wearables, it just makes it much less frictionless, right? People are more able to do it. And AstraZeneca did a great study looking at inhaled therapies, which was almost fully remote. So it's very helpful when we can do it for everyone. And also, as we And at AstraZeneca, we're incredibly committed to our sustainability portfolio and becoming carbon neutral as quickly as possible. If we can do more trials where people have to travel less, that's a significant impact on carbon as well. So again, yet another good reason to really push forward with that. And I'm sure we'll get to talk about it in a minute, but as AI comes in, we're still in infancy, I think, in pharma and how we're going to use it. But we do recognize that some of those repetitive tasks are the things it should make easier moving forward, and it should decrease the demands both on our investigators and the people who are kind enough to go into our trials.
And of course, you mentioned really having the patient input from the very beginning. I think it's very important to help inform trial design and every aspect of the drug development process, essentially. And so, what is your approach to that, the medical strategy in medical affairs to really have that patient voice? As we talk about, we hear all of these terms, but really, what do they mean in terms of the application, and to do that in a robust, organic, and effective manner to really incorporate the patient voice, and then also to integrate that voice with all of the other players in the ecosystem, the drug development ecosystem that you talked about. So whether it's clinicians to sponsors and other industry players. So what does that ecosystem look like today? And how do you manage all of those moving parts?
Yeah, no, really important, right? So, I mean, we've got a clear set of values at AstraZeneca, and one of them is to put the patient at the center of everything we do. And I think medical is a key function to do that because we are close to people with asthma, people with COPD. We're close to the clinicians, we're close to the pathways. So I think it's beholden on medical to really hold the patients front and center. There are always going to be competing demands across the functions, but I can say, hand on my heart, at AstraZeneca, whenever I've said, okay, this is not the right thing to do for patients, or what do people with COPD, asthma really want, then that always resonates. And it actually becomes a very good way of making sure that that's at the center of everything, because in terms of any discussion, it kind of trumps everything else. Otherwise, why are we in the industry? If we can't put people that we're trying to look after at the center and think about how we make it better, then we shouldn't be working in pharma. So I think we do get a very clear steer on that. We have very good, we work very closely with patient and advocacy groups in many countries. We absolutely take on board when we're doing clinical trial design. We have ways of doing that, obviously, to take that on board. We work with our key external experts, and we try and weave our patient stories into everything we do. And whenever we're having a big internal meeting, it's the most powerful thing to hear from people that either we have produced a drug that's transformed their lives, or they're not quite there yet. And it is still humbling, and I have to be careful because it does still catch me sometimes, particularly now that I'm not looking after people every day. And then I go, oh my goodness. And I will never forget the time after I joined AstraZeneca, and then someone that I'd looked after gave a testimony, and it just humbled me because, I'd see someone for 15 minutes in a clinic, and I would forget how much diseases could just take over people's lives, and how it's our job to take these diseases that are taking over people's lives and squash them all down so they're just a tiny part. And you might notice when I'm talking, I try and talk about people with asthma, people with CBD rather than patients, because that's what they are. That's what people are, right? And our job is to make someone who happens to have asthma but doesn't have to take their inhalers anymore every day, and so they can be a productive mother, father, son, daughter, member of society who happens to have a label which we've completely treated and just taken that disease off the pitch for them.
That's just so resonating when you said that you refer to people as people and not just patients. They're not just specimens or participants in a trial or a number. So yeah, definitely that also really touched me. So thank you so much for coming at it from that perspective. I can really feel your passion, and that's yeah. Thank you so much. And let me see. Sorry, I got carried away just listening. Next question. Yeah. I got a bit emotional there. Like, thank you. Like, that was, yeah. Let's see. The next question is, oh yes. I don't think I have this question in here, but I wanted to, do I? Yeah, but I just thought about, I wanted to ask if it's okay, just in terms of, I know biologics are really the focus in a lot of spaces these days, and rightfully so, because they're probably the best designed in terms of offering that targeted treatment and therapy, as we talk about. Do you think that biologics are the mainstay currently, or are there other um, therapeutics or small molecules still in the equation? And of course, you talk about combining therapies. If you can still have steroids, maybe lowering the dose, or just also treating symptoms and the root causes simultaneously, of course. And so, do you think biologics are the future, or are there other approaches that are up and
Yeah,
coming?
I mean, I think a really great question. So in respiratory, certainly biologics are incredibly helpful for the right people with severe asthma, but that's probably only about 5 to 10% of people with asthma. So the majority can be very well controlled with inhaled therapies as long as we give them in the right way. And there's a lot of logic to using inhaled therapies in respiratory diseases because we give it to the target organ directly. And I think I don't see a time when we completely move away from inhaled therapies. We'd love to develop better oral therapies because some people don't like to take inhalers. That even with our best intention, they're quite hard to take correctly. And I tend to forget how to tell people how to take them, and then the people that I was looking after would forget over time. So it needs a lot of education and reinforcement. So oral therapies still definitely could have a place there. I think I haven't talked that much about immunology, but if we think about immunology and biologics, down the line, we're starting to think about more transformative therapies such as CAR T cells. So obviously we've got experience with CAR T cells in oncology, but we're starting to see that now develop within immunology, particularly in B cell driven diseases where we could switch off, take out the B cells that are pumping out the autoantibodies. And that's incredibly exciting because I mean, it's very early data and we're a long way away from where we want to get to. But there is the potential for long term remission or maybe even cure. So, for some diseases like lupus, which is a truly devastating disease, to move away from high doses of oral steroids and other drugs and biologics to potentially, for the right person down the line, CAR T therapy or similar, and to allow for a long term remission of drug or even potentially a cure, I think is like incredibly exciting for the future.
And when we talk about the future, I guess we can't do so without technologies like AI, whether or not it's here, whether or not it's going to just be a bubble, is it a fad? What is the utility of it in a space like in pharma and drug development? Is it hype? Is there or really what are the applications of it? And then apart from AI, of course, digital health, biomarkers, there's just so many technologies that we're seeing being leveraged in drug development today. And so which are some of the most important ones in your perspective
Yeah.
going forward?
So, so great question, a really important question. And I think in terms of it'll be easy in 5 or 10 years with hindsight to say where AI sits, right? But I mean, I think one thing that it will undoubtedly help us with is repetitive tasks, be that protocol writing, be that presentations, whatever. It's gonna help as a tool to help our staff do things better, do things more creatively. So it's going to be super helpful for that. Um, where it's going to be helpful in research, I think we're going to have to wait and see. We're obviously investing in AI heavily as we should do, and trying to work out where it's going to be in the future. In terms of healthcare, I think AI could be very good at pattern recognition. So I think, for instance, for reading scans, reading CT scans, it can help augment humans to do that more quickly and to see very subtle changes that we won't necessarily always pick up to predict future risk. And we can see also the role of AI interrogating electronic medical records to pull out various data using natural language processing and others to really then again identify a high risk person, prompt the healthcare professional to say, have you thought about this? And then direct towards guideline directed medical therapy to make sure that people are identified early, put on the right treatment as early as possible. And then I think, we've seen like with the Apple Watch, other smartwatches are available. It can pick up people in atrial fibrillation, right? And that's a massive step forward. and it can identify symptoms beforehand. We haven't cracked wearables in respiratory, but I see a time when we do, because at the end of the day, one of the things we want to do in respiratory is prevent exacerbations, acute deteriorations. And if you have a smartwatch or that geolocates you, that looks at your level of physical activity, etc., it should be able to say that actually you're now in an area where there's a high pollen area. If you're allergic, or you're in an area of high pollution, your physical activity is going down. I wonder if you're about to exacerbate. Let's prompt you to do some more measurements and then contact your HCP. So we're in its infancy, but I can see it being an incredibly helpful tool to pick up as an early warning score on the individual person level, on the macro level, to help healthcare systems identify high-risk patients earlier and make sure they go into the right guideline-directed medical therapy. And then a significant input into how we develop and deliver clinical trials within pharma as well.
And how do you see the space evolving? I know it's a very broad question, but in respiratory and immunology, you spoke about the different approaches, therapies, CAR T cells, whether it's biologics or oral therapies continuing as well, maybe next gen. But really, how do you envision this space evolving, and what kinds of things are you looking forward to leading in that space?
Yeah, I mean, I think across respiratory and immunology, really sort of achieving remission and switching off the disease with whatever drug or modality we use much earlier, so that people haven't got significant damage from the disease, and also they haven't got significant damage from the amount of oral steroids they've had to take. And I frequently use the example of rheumatoid arthritis. Sadly, when I went to medical school, which is a long time ago now, I would see people with, we see people with rheumatoid arthritis with classic rheumatoid arthritis deformities of their hands, which are in the textbooks, and you'd see. Now people get the biologic far earlier in primary care before any joint deformity has occurred. So they don't lose any function. They don't have to have huge amounts of oral corticosteroids. And that's really my ambition and passion for respiratory and immunology more broadly. So we do that. So we're identifying people early that are high risk, that need these targeted interventions. We intervene early so they don't lose their lung function. They don't get all the awful complications we can see with lupus and other immune-mediated diseases. And equally importantly, they're not getting those side effects from high doses and prolonged cumulative exposure to oral corticosteroids. So, I mean, it's a really fascinating time to be in this space, and a really rewarding time to be in this space, because we can see these tangible benefits now pulling through.
And without wanting to have you divulge too much, but what are some of the exciting milestones, let's say, that you're most looking forward to at AstraZeneca, from the pipeline or just in general, really, in moving the spaces forward?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, you have to be very careful.
Yes, exactly. That's why I'm
In the public domain. But so I think one highlight that we've had already for this year is one of our biologics that targets TSLP test-bar. We've had some really positive results in chronic rhinosinusitis with nasal polyps, presented at the big American Allergy and Immunology Congress earlier on this year. Huge excitement again, because that resonates with me as a clinician, because you used to look after people with nasal polyps, and first you think, well, that isn't that bad a condition, right? You don't tend to die of nasal polyps, but actually you've got a continuous cold, right? Your head is all blocked and stuffy. Your sinuses are painful. You can't smell anything, and people would take steroid tablets with those side effects to relieve that, because it was that bad. So this, for me, is a really exciting move forward, and it's the first step for this molecule into a franchise, which I think is very nice. And then, as we look forward, we've got a great immunology pipeline. I can't say too much about it, but we can see how we can really transform. And again, I'm equally passionate around lupus and other immune-mediated diseases, because all the same problems are there. And one thing that I really hope that, as industry and science and everyone really gets together and shifts the needle on, is COPD. Because I said earlier on, it's a third leading cause of death. And it's lagged behind in terms of research from where we are with asthma. And we've got some assets in development for COPD, as have many other companies. And having looked after people with COPD, I know how much they need our help. So I'm really hoping that our biologics and others come through and really start to transform the lives of people with COPD.
Yeah, I think not a lot of us realize how much of a burden, as we talk about COPD, really is as the third leading cause of death. Like, that's so significant and, really important to have that being a very important area of focus. So, absolutely. And then finally, as you mentioned that you've learned more in the past 2 years at AstraZeneca in industry than you did in the past 10 years. And that's so interesting because we often find ourselves in spaces where that does happen. And so looking back and looking forward as well, what kind of advice, let's say, would you give to emerging leaders in looking to get into pharma, biotech, entrepreneurs in smaller biotech to really make an impact and to really bring their passions forward?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, it is an amazing place to work, right? You get to do some really impactful, meaningful stuff. So I never have an issue about motivating myself to come to work every day, and neither do my team. And I think as a clinician, to see the complexity of bringing drugs all the way from discovery through to me being able to prescribe was mind-blowing isn't too big a word, right? You just didn't understand it. And I think what I also learned was when I joined pharma, there were so many different roles. You can find the one that really ignites you and ignites your passion, from clinical development to medical affairs to regulatory to whatever it is. And obviously, if you're in a smaller company, then you get to do a lot of these things all at once, which has its own strengths and weaknesses as a consequence. But I mean, I think if you're passionate about transforming the lives of people, if you really want to make a difference, there aren't many better places to work than pharma. If you've got a healthcare background and you really want to, at the end of the day, go home and say, we made a difference today, it's a fabulous place to work.
Dr. Menzies-Gow, thank you so much for all of the insights and that you've shared with us today, and above all, just the amazing, impactful work that you're leading at AstraZeneca. Thank you so much for everything that you do, and thank you once again for your time.
No, thank you. I've really enjoyed our conversation.
All right, that's the end of this episode of the Xtalks Life Science Podcast. If you liked today's show, don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe. Thank you, everyone, and we will see you next time.
To join the Xtalks community, visit xtalks.com and register for exclusive access to curated content like live webinars, news articles, and educational videos. The views and opinions expressed in this podcast are those of the speakers sharing them and should not be taken as professional advice, nor do they necessarily reflect the policy or position of Honeycomb Worldwide. For further information, email us at podcast@xtalks.com.